A young nurse answered a call in Polish in front of a billionaire patient. The next day, she lost her job. It was a cold Monday morning when Danielle Harper resumed her shift at the pristine hospital room in Los Angeles. The day felt very normal, like any other, unaware that her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. Danielle entered room 312, where her patient, Edward Langston, lay recovering from a recent surgery. At 60 years old, Edward was a businessman whose once vibrant energy had been dimmed by his medical condition. "Your vitals are stable," she said gently, making sure to speak calmly so he could hear the care in her voice. "You're doing well. Just keep resting, and we'll have you back on your feet in no time." Edward's response was minimal, just a slight nod. He wasn't one to speak much, especially not to a nurse he had only just met. But there was something in his gaze. Something that suggested he was deeply aware of everything around him, even if he chose to remain silent. As Danielle finished her assessment, her phone vibrated softly in her pocket. She pulled it out, seeing that it was an incoming call from her elderly mother. Danielle's heart softened at the sight of her mother's name flashing on the screen. The woman was a rock in her life, always offering wisdom and love, even from miles away. The call wasn't long, just a quick check-in. Danielle had grown accustomed to these moments, the connection to her roots, even in the middle of a hectic workday. She answered the call softly, lowering her voice slightly to maintain the privacy of her patient. "Hello, Mama," she greeted in Polish, the language flowing naturally from her lips. On the other end of the line, her mother's voice crackled through, filled with concern. "Danielle, did you take your vitamins today?" Her mother asked, the tone of a mother's care evident in her words. Danielle smiled, her eyes briefly drifting to Edward, who remained still, though she couldn't be sure if he was listening or simply lost in thought. "Yes, Mama, I did. And I'll be home soon, I promise," she reassured her mother, her voice tender as she spoke. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down. The world outside the hospital room faded away as Danielle spoke to her mother, reminding her to take her medication, checking in on her well-being, and promising she would be home to visit soon. It was a brief conversation, a loving exchange between mother and daughter, but it was a reminder of the family ties that anchored her, even as she worked tirelessly in a high-pressure job. The conversation ended just as quickly as it had begun. Danielle said her goodbyes, made a final promise to visit soon, and hung up the phone, slipping it back into her pocket. She turned to Edward, offering him a polite smile, but his expression had not changed. He was still watching her, but there was a quiet intensity in his gaze now. He didn't speak, nor did he offer any reaction to the phone call. Danielle was unaware of the significance of the moment. It was just another routine day, another patient, another phone call. But Edward Langston had been listening. In fact, he had heard every word of her conversation. His ears had pricked when he recognized the foreign language, the soft melody of Polish. Edward's mind raced as he processed what he had just heard. He had been searching for someone who could help him with a crucial business deal, one that could change the course of his life. He had been looking for someone who spoke Polish fluently, someone who could bridge the gap in a crucial negotiation. And now, the solution had appeared, quite by accident. But instead of seeing the connection as a fortunate stroke of luck, Edward's thoughts turned cold. He had seen something he could use. The language, Danielle's fluency in Polish, was now the key to a door he needed to open. And, as he thought more about it, he realized that he would need her to focus entirely on him. He would need her to be free of her hospital duties, free of any distractions. Without a word to Danielle, Edward remained still in his bed, his eyes never leaving her as she completed her rounds. Little did Danielle know, the man she had just treated with such kindness was already plotting her future, a future that would take an unexpected and drastic turn. The following day, Danielle arrived at the hospital ready for another shift. She had no idea that things would be different. As the day wore on, Danielle was called into her supervisor's office. The walls of the office felt colder than usual, and a sense of unease washed over her as she entered. Her supervisor, a stern-faced woman with an air of authority, sat behind her desk. The moment Danielle walked in, she knew something was wrong. "Danielle, please have a seat," the supervisor said, her tone sharp. Danielle sat, her heart already sinking. "We need to talk about an incident that occurred yesterday." Danielle was immediately confused. What incident? She had been careful, professional, as always. But the words that followed hit her like a slap in the face. A patient had filed a complaint against her. The reason? Unprofessional conduct, her supervisor explained, though Danielle's mind was already racing. Apparently, your use of a foreign language during care hours made the patient uncomfortable. He expressed concerns about your professionalism. Danielle's heart skipped a beat. She had been careful to keep personal matters separate from her work, but she knew she had spoken Polish on the phone with her mother. But it was a brief call, one that she had taken in private. How could something so innocent lead to her termination? The supervisor continued, but Danielle's world had already stopped. She heard the words, but they felt distant, surreal. You are being let go effective immediately. Please gather your belongings. Crushed. Humiliated. Danielle felt the weight of the world pressing on her chest. The tears threatened, but she fought them back, not wanting to appear weak. She had always prided herself on her professionalism, on her ability to remain calm in any situation. But this was different. Her dignity was stripped away in an instant. As she packed her things, Danielle couldn't help but wonder, was it really the language that bothered the patient, or was there something more? She had no idea that the man she had just treated so kindly, the man she had taken care of just hours before, was the very one who had filed the complaint. The rain had started falling sometime after sunset. A soft drizzle at first, barely a whisper against the window panes of the cramped apartment where Danielle Harper sat alone, staring into the void of her living room. The streetlight outside flickered on and off, casting a nervous orange glow across her modest walls and illuminating the unopened bills that were fanned out across the kitchen table like a losing poker hand. Her apartment was quiet, too quiet. Gone was the beeping of heart monitors, the hurried footsteps of nurses, the reassuring white noise of hospital life. All that remained was the oppressive silence of uncertainty. Danielle sat curled up on the couch, wearing an oversized sweatshirt and cradling a lukewarm cup of tea. Her eyes were glassy, red from the tears she had been too proud to shed earlier in public. Being fired had shaken her to her core, not because she believed she had done anything wrong, but because of the way it had happened, swift, without question, and with no room to explain herself. She had always believed that if she worked hard, treated people kindly, and remained diligent, good things would come. But the world, as it turned out, didn't always reward kindness. Sometimes it punished it. The call still played over and over in her head. Her mother's soft voice. The comfort of speaking her native Polish, just for a moment. And the silence of her patient, Edward Langston, as he listened, giving no indication of what was to come. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, cutting through the silence. The screen lit up. Unknown number. Danielle stared at it. A twinge of anxiety curled in her stomach. She was in no mood for telemarketers or collection agents. Still, something told her to answer. She hesitated, then swiped the screen and brought the phone to her ear. "Hello," she said, her voice cautious. There was a brief pause, and then a voice, smooth, composed, unmistakably familiar, came through the line. "Miss Harper." "This is Edward Langston." Danielle froze. It was as if time had folded in on itself. She sat upright, her pulse quickening, her eyes suddenly alert. She had imagined this man in her mind 100 times since being fired, had questioned whether it was truly him who complained. Now here he was, calling her personally. "What? Why are you calling me?" she asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. There was an edge to her words, not quite anger, but something close to it. "I owe you an explanation," Edward said, unbothered by the hostility in her tone. "And an opportunity." Danielle frowned, confused. "An explanation? You had me fired. You could have just talked to me, asked me if I'd step outside next time. You didn't have to destroy my career." "I didn't destroy it," he replied calmly. "I redirected it." The arrogance in his voice made Danielle's jaw tighten. She didn't respond immediately, waiting for him to continue. "I listened to you speak to your mother," Edward said. "In Polish. You didn't know I understood any of it, did you?" "No," she said flatly. "Well, I do. Enough to recognize fluency when I hear it. Enough to know that you weren't speaking casually, you were speaking with comfort, confidence. Like a native." Danielle leaned back on the couch, eyes narrowing. "What are you getting at?" "I've spent the last 9 months looking for someone like you. A Polish-English translator who can operate in high-pressure environments. I'm in the final stages of negotiating an international deal, something massive. 5 countries. Billions of dollars. One of the key stakeholders is a private investment firm in Warsaw. They've refused to work through English. Every translator I've brought in so far has fumbled. Too stiff, too academic. They don't understand the nuance, the tone, the rhythm of real conversation. Danielle was stunned. So, what? You fired me so I'd be free to work for you. Yes. You realize how absurd that sounds, right? That you've appended my life for some business deal? Edward's voice softened slightly. I didn't do it out of cruelty, Miss Harper. I did it because I needed to make sure you were available. You were shackled to that hospital. I couldn't afford to wait and see if you consider taking time off. Danielle stared at the wall. It was the most insane thing she'd ever heard. And yet, he sounded sincere. He sounded like a man used to moving mountains to get what he wanted. Let me be clear, Edward continued. This isn't just some favor I'm asking. It's a paid job. 1 week in Poland. Private jet. Full security. Discretion. Professionalism. You'll be present at every meeting, every closed-door discussion. Your job is to be my voice when I can't speak theirs. Danielle's mouth was dry. And the pay? $50 million. She almost dropped the phone. Excuse me. $50 million. He repeated, as though it were just another line item on a spreadsheet. Danielle stood, pacing now. Why would you offer that much? That's more than I'd make in 5 lifetimes as a nurse. Because if this deal goes through, I walk away with $10 billion. You're the difference between it happening or not. She felt the floor shift under her feet. The job she'd been fired from had barely covered her rent. Now she was being offered generational wealth. Because she spoke the language her mother taught her. And what if I say no, she asked. Then I'll find someone else, he said, with just the faintest edge of challenge. But I don't think I will. Because you're smarter than that. Danielle sat down again, her mind spinning. She thought of her mother, of the medical bills, of the nights she'd gone without sleep, balancing double shifts and school loans. And then she thought of how easily she had been discarded. How quickly the hospital had let her go without even a second thought. This wasn't just about the money. This was about reclaiming her worth. I need 24 hours, she said. You have 12, Edward replied. My jet leaves tomorrow morning. And just like that, the line went dead. Danielle sat in silence, phone still pressed to her ear. Rain tapped against the windows like an echo of her racing thoughts. She stood, walked to the kitchen table, and looked down at the pile of unpaid bills. Her life had been about survival for so long, she hadn't remembered what possibility felt like. That night, she barely slept. Her dreams were fragmented, visions of boardrooms, foreign skylines, her mother smiling in the kitchen, the gentle cadence of Polish spoken like a lullaby. When the morning came, Danielle stood at the edge of a decision. The wheels of the private jet kissed the runway with barely a tremble. Morning light stretched across the tarmac, casting a golden hue over the Polish capital. Warsaw sharp-edged, stoic, alive with a cold breath that made you stand straighter. For Danielle Harper, the moment the plane touched down felt like stepping into another life. She descended the stairs slowly, the hem of her navy trench coat brushing against her calves, her heels clicking softly against the metal. Her breath clouded in the chilly November air, but her stride held a calm determination. Beneath the layers of travel fatigue and adrenaline, a quiet storm brewed, equal parts nerves, disbelief, and rising resolve. Just days ago, she had walked out of a hospital with a cardboard box and a name stained by silence. Now she stood on a foreign tarmac in the capital of her ancestors' homeland, about to step into one of the largest business negotiations in modern history. Edward Langston waited at the bottom of the steps, looking not unlike the image that had formed in her mind. Sharply dressed in a charcoal wool coat, leather gloves, and an expression that mixed calculation with subtle approval. Miss Harper, he said as she reached him. His tone was formal, but there was an undeniable shift in the way he looked at her now, like a man aware he'd made the right bet. Mr. Langston, she replied, offering a slight nod. Jet lag? He asked, gesturing for her to follow him toward the waiting black Mercedes. I've had worse, she said, sliding into the warmth of the car's leather interior. As the vehicle pulled away from the airport, Warsaw unfurled before her eyes. It was a city of contradictions. Glass skyscrapers reflected the pastel silhouettes of pre-war buildings, history and innovation layered like sediment. The skyline bristled with ambition, and the streets hummed with the energy of a people who had rebuilt from ashes. Edward broke the silence. We're dealing with a consortium of 5 major investors. 3 are Polish nationals, very traditional, very language conscious. 1 is Swiss, 1 American. The Polish side has been guarded. Every word matters. They want to believe they're being understood beyond translation. They want respect. Authenticity. Danielle nodded, absorbing every word. I've had 3 interpreters fumble, he continued, his voice taut with frustration. Too mechanical. Too formal. You're not here to translate syllables. You're here to translate intention, tone, trust. Danielle turned her head to the window, watching the city blur past. And you think I can do that? She said more as a statement than a question. Edward glanced at her. I know you can. You spoke to your mother with a kind of fluency none of them had. It was natural, emotional. That's what they need to hear. They arrived at the hotel, a towering modern glass structure that gleamed against the gray sky. Inside, it was all marble, soft lights, and hushed luxury. The concierge greeted Edward with deference and handed Danielle a room key without question. We'll begin briefings at 3 p.m., Edward said. You'll meet the legal team, review the proposal documents, and practice responses. The actual negotiations begin tomorrow morning. Understood, Danielle said. He paused. And Danielle, yes, don't just translate. Lead them. Use your voice. For a moment, the air shifted. It was no longer a matter of obligation or money. It was something more powerful, belief. She entered her suite in silence, the automatic door hissing softly behind her. The room was expansive, decorated in minimalist elegance. A basket of fruit sat on the table. Her luggage had already been brought up. Everything was perfect, except her. She dropped her coat on the armchair and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. The view was stunning. Rooftops stretching out into the horizon, church spires rising defiantly against the gray, the river Vistula cutting a silver path through it all. Below, signs glowed in bold, familiar letters: Aptika, Piekarnia, Kawiarnia. Polish. Her first language. The one that, just a few days ago, cost her a job. And now? It was the very reason she was here, standing in a 5-star hotel on the edge of rewriting her destiny. She rested her forehead against the cool glass and allowed herself to feel it. The weight, the wonder, the anger, and the awe. How quickly the world turned when someone heard your voice, really heard it, and didn't ask you to silence it. After a brief rest, she changed into a tailored suit, slate gray with a white blouse, subtle gold earrings, and her mother's silver cross around her neck. It wasn't for fashion. It was armor. She descended to the conference floor where Edward and his team waited. What followed was a whirlwind of information in documents, strategies, timelines, and stakeholder profiles. Danielle took notes, asked sharp questions, and requested audio clips of the Polish negotiators speaking in previous meetings to study their speech patterns. By the end of the day, she was no longer just a nurse-turned-translator. She was a strategist, a communicator, a weapon. As night fell, she returned to her suite, too wired to sleep. Instead, she stood once more at the window, watching Warsaw flicker beneath her. Her phone vibrated. A message from her mother. Call me when you can. I saw the news. You look so beautiful, Mojci echo. Danielle's heart clenched. Somehow, word had spread. Her photo had been captured at the airport. A brief news flash titled, American Polish translator joins high-stakes investment deal in Warsaw. She called. Her mother answered on the first ring. Danielle. Oh my God. Are you okay? I saw you on the news. Your coat looked expensive, her mother said in a mix of worry and pride. Danielle laughed for the first time in days. I'm okay, Mama. I'm really okay. I don't understand all of it. But they said your name. They said you were representing America and Poland. Danielle's throat tightened. I'm just trying to do my part. You've always done your part. They just didn't see it until now. They spoke for a while longer. Danielle hung up with her heart full. She turned from the window, sat at the desk, and began reviewing her notes again. Tomorrow, the real test began. But tonight, she allowed herself one small, powerful thought. She wasn't just speaking Polish anymore. She was speaking power. The elevator ascended in silence, glass walls revealing the sharp, cold skyline of Warsaw. Morning sun pierced through clouds, streaking the city in pale gold. The world below was muted, distant. But inside Danielle Harper, everything buzzed. Like static before lightning. Floor 42. The doors slid open with a soft chime. A sleek hallway of matte black walls and soft ambient lighting led to a single polished oak door. Beyond it, the boardroom where the future would shift. The international investors were already seated. Edward Langston walked just ahead of Danielle, his expression unreadable but his posture sharp. He nodded once to her, his way of saying, "It's time." Danielle inhaled deeply and stepped into the room. It was vast and surgical in its elegance. Glass walls with sweeping views of the Vistula River, a long obsidian conference table, and chairs spaced with precision. 12 men and women sat in silence, the air dense with money and mistrust. At the far end sat the Polish delegates, Mr. Wojciech Rilski, the stoic patriarch of the Rilski Consortium, his son, Jakub, sharp-eyed and coiled like a spring, and Ms. Magdalena Stasek, poised and cool, the only woman at their table, and the only one who didn't immediately look through Danielle. To the left were the Americans and Swiss, watching, calculating. Every word in the coming hours would carry the weight of empires. Danielle sat beside Edward, her black notebook open, pen poised, but hand steady. Her blouse was crisp white, her lips bare of gloss. There was nothing flashy about her today. She had no need for dazzle. Her voice would be her power. A Swiss lawyer cleared his throat and began. Edward leaned slightly toward Danielle. "Go ahead," he whispered. She spoke. First, in English, then seamlessly in Polish. Her voice was clear, intentional, and warm, but never casual. It filled the room not with volume, but with gravity. The kind of voice that made others lean in without realizing it. The Polish delegates watched her closely. She didn't just translate. She lived each sentence. She matched cadences, softened harsh idioms, caught subtle jokes in Polish and reworded them, so they landed with equal finesse in English. When someone misspoke slightly, she adjusted with diplomacy that made it sound purposeful. When a metaphor didn't quite translate, she substituted it with one rooted in Polish folklore, earning a subtle smile from Mr. Rilski. The negotiation was intense. Billions were at stake. Intellectual property rights, data security, long-term equity sharing, all a labyrinth of legal jargon and business maneuvering. Danielle was the bridge, walking each side safely across a cultural chasm. Edward spoke of innovation, strategic partnerships, market expansion. Danielle translated his words with just the right level of optimism and respect, avoiding the bravado that might sour the tone with the traditionally conservative Polish side. Midway through the morning, there was a hiccup. Jakub Rilski furrowed his brow, leaned forward, and said sharply in Polish, "This sounds like colonization disguised as investment." A beat of stunned silence filled the room. Edward didn't understand. The Americans shifted uncomfortably, but Danielle held the moment. She turned calmly to Jakub. "I hear your concern," she said in Polish, her tone steady, respectful, but firm. "But this isn't about taking, this is about building. You're not handing over land. You're planting roots that grow on both sides of the ocean. That's the proposal." Jakub looked at her, surprised. His eyes narrowed, but there was curiosity there now, not hostility. Danielle continued in Polish, directing her words to the whole delegation. "There's always risk in opening doors. But there's greater risk in refusing to walk through them. What this deal offers is not surrender, it's partnership on your terms. Edward isn't asking for control. He's offering a handshake." The room shifted. Tension melted just a little. Magdalena Stasek leaned forward, folded her hands, and asked a direct question to Danielle, in Polish. "What about integrity? When money moves like this, something always gets lost. What assurance do we have that our legacy won't become someone else's footnote?" Danielle looked at her, not as a translator, but as a woman. She answered not just as Edward's voice, but her own. "I understand legacy," she said softly. "My mother raised me on Polish lullabies while scrubbing floors in a city that couldn't pronounce our names. I know what it feels like to be erased in the name of profit. But I also know that when we control our seat at the table, we get to write the narrative." Magdalena's eyes softened. There was no rebuttal. Edward turned slightly to Danielle and murmured, "Well played." Lunch was served. Coffee refilled. Papers were passed back and forth. Revisions were suggested, clauses debated. Danielle remained a constant presence. She caught rising tempers before they boiled. She preempted miscommunications. She became the invisible oil that allowed the great gears of industry to turn smoothly. By late afternoon, after hours of negotiation, the final documents were ready for signing. There were no triumphant speeches, no dramatic pauses, just pens uncapped and pages turned. One by one, the investors signed. Jakub signed last, slowly, with a sideways glance at Danielle. He gave her a small nod, not of approval, but of acknowledgement. Respect. When the final page was inked, the mood in the room shifted. Relief, achievement, power. People rose from their seats. Hands were shaken. Laughter returned to faces. A toast was poured. Cameras were ushered in for a brief photo op. Edward turned to Danielle. For the first time, he looked at her not as an asset, or even as a professional, but as an equal. "None of this would have happened without you," he said. His voice, usually measured and cool, carried something new: gratitude. Danielle smiled, her exhaustion mixing with disbelief. She had never envisioned this moment, never even dared to. She turned to the window. Warsaw sprawled below them, rooftops catching the light like polished stones. Just days ago, she had been fired for speaking Polish. Today, she had spoken it in a room that shifted global economies. A reporter approached her gently, notebook in hand. "Excuse me, Miss Harper," she said. "How does it feel to be the voice behind a $500 billion deal?" Danielle looked at her, the corners of her lips tugging into a smile. "It feels like the world finally learned how to listen." It had rained the night before, and the streets of Los Angeles still shimmered with a damp sheen as the sun rose on a new day, casting soft light over the city and onto Danielle Harper, who stood across the street from St. Elora's Memorial Hospital, the very place that had once been her workplace and the site of the most humiliating moment of her life. She sipped quietly from a paper coffee cup, staring at the familiar glass doors with no intention of going in, her mind a swirl of emotions. Not bitterness, but a reflective quiet, a sense of witnessing the chapter that had closed long ago when she had been fired for the simple act of speaking Polish to her mother during a shift, a moment of kindness mistaken for unprofessionalism, a language of love treated like a crime. And as the wind tugged at the hem of her coat, she turned her back on that building not in anger but in resolve, walking forward into a life that she had since claimed for herself, a life shaped not by rejection, but by purpose. And just 6 months later, the sun beamed down on a different building across town, where a crowd gathered outside a sleek, modern facility for its grand opening, the Harper Wellness Center. Where flowers framed the entryway, reporters adjusted microphones, and the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation for what was about to unfold. And when Danielle stepped forward to address the audience, dressed in a navy coat dress, radiating quiet power, she looked every bit the leader she had become. Her voice firm and graceful as she thanked everyone present and recounted how she had once been told her language was unwelcome in healthcare, that her identity as a Polish-speaking nurse had somehow been considered a threat to comfort, and how that very moment sparked a question within her. What if there was a place where language was not a barrier but a bridge, where empathy was not a luxury but a standard? And what if the very thing that got her dismissed could instead become the foundation for something revolutionary? And with the ribbon cut and the doors flung open, guests flooded inside to discover a medical facility unlike any other. Bathed in natural light, designed in warm earth tones, decorated with multilingual signage and art from diverse cultures, and staffed by a team of professionals who spoke not just different languages but also a shared philosophy of care centered on dignity, understanding, and community. And as Danielle walked those halls, patients and staff greeting her with respect and ease, she couldn't help but marvel at the transformation, not just of a building, but of herself. From a silenced nurse to the visionary founder of a space where no one would ever be punished for embracing who they were. And when Edward Langston, the man who once filed the complaint that changed everything, handed her a letter from the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs commending the center's model, she knew she had come full circle, that she had turned pain into purpose, that the same voice which once trembled in fear now carried the weight of change. And later, as night fell and the halls grew quiet, Danielle stepped outside into the garden where a small plaque sat beneath a stone bench, engraved with the words, "To the ones who were told they were too different to heal. This place is yours. Speak freely." And sitting there under the stars, she allowed herself to feel the gravity of what had been built. Not out of revenge, but out of reclamation. And when, days later, a Polish grandmother gently squeezed her hand in thanks for creating a space where she could finally be understood, Danielle simply smiled and whispered, "There's always been space. We just needed the keys." And in that moment, everything, the dismissal, the call, the journey to Warsaw, the boardroom, the decision to start again, folded into a single truth. that sometimes the very thing they try to silence is the sound that can rebuild the world. It was a warm afternoon in Los Angeles, the kind that hinted at spring even though the calendar still clung to winter, and inside a sunlit auditorium of the downtown Community Health Conference, rows of chairs filled steadily as murmurs floated through the air. Students with notebooks, healthcare workers with lanyards, retired nurses holding paper programs. Everyone waiting for the final speaker of the day, the woman whose story had quietly traveled across continents and headlines alike, whose name had become a symbol of quiet revolution in a field too often ruled by silence and sameness, Danielle Harper. Now the founder of the Harper Wellness Center stepped calmly onto the stage, her presence a blend of grace and conviction, and as the lights dimmed, she stood behind the podium, scanning the crowd. Not to impress, but to connect, her voice soft but steady as she began. "A year ago, I was fired from a hospital I loved," she said. "No dramatics, just truth." And the room stilled, leaning in. "My crime?" Speaking to my mother in Polish. My language, our language, the only way she knows how to understand the world. And for a moment, the echo of that old hospital room returned, not in sound, but in memory, in the quiet vulnerability of a daughter answering her mother's call right after checking her patient's vitals, reminding her to take her heart medication, to eat something warm, to rest. And behind her, as she continued, the screen flickered to life with images from her journey. A flashback of that moment in the hospital room, the way her patient Edward Langston had watched silently, saying nothing, only to lodge the complaint that cost her everything. And yet, there was no bitterness in her retelling, only clarity. "They told me it made someone uncomfortable," she said with a hint of a wry smile, as if love in another language could threaten healing. And there was a long pause where no one moved, where the weight of the words settled over the room like dust. Catching the light, and then came the twist, the turning point in her story that always left people stunned. "What I didn't know then," she said, her tone shifting gently, "was that the man who filed that complaint wasn't offended, he was desperate." And the next image filled the screen. Danielle in her apartment, staring at her phone in disbelief as Edward's voice spoke over the line, revealing he had needed her, not punished her out of malice, but maneuvered her life to make room for something else. An international deal, a billion-dollar opportunity, and her voice, her heritage, her knowledge of Polish, was the missing key, and suddenly, the story pivoted not into victimhood but into reclamation. "He offered me $50 million to come to Poland," she said, and a small ripple of gasps moved through the crowd even though many already knew this part, to be a translator for a deal that would change the face of his company forever, and again. The screen flashed scenes of Warsaw. The private jet, the chilly morning she stepped onto the tarmac, the conversations in the back of a black sedan driving past the Vistula River, the nerves in her chest that night as she looked out over the glowing skyline from her hotel window, wondering how a language that had once been a liability was now the very tool opening doors. But it wasn't just the language, Danielle continued, it was understanding. Reading tones, navigating cultural nuance, knowing when to pause, when to rephrase, when to say nothing at all. And then the image on the screen shifted to that elegant Warsaw boardroom, where Edward sat surrounded by international investors and Danielle beside him, calm, poised, translating not only words but meaning, decoding tension, offering context where the literal failed. And when the final agreement was signed and the room erupted in applause, it wasn't Edward's triumph alone, but hers too, because without her, it would have unraveled. "The very thing I was punished for," she said now, looking out at the crowd, "became my greatest gift," and her voice didn't rise, didn't break, it held, firm and clear, not just a declaration, but an invitation. And as she spoke, more images flowed. Her returning to Los Angeles, standing outside the same hospital that had turned her away, pausing for only a breath before walking forward, not back, but towards something new. And then came the ribbon cutting of the Harper Wellness Center, the vision she built with her own hands and the partnership of someone who had, however unorthodox, believed in her worth. She described the early days. Staffing the center with multilingual nurses, ensuring signage appeared in every language spoken in the surrounding communities, designing clinics that reflected cultural needs, training doctors not only in medicine, but in humility and presence, and slowly, the audience saw what she was saying, that healing was never just about fixing the body. It was about being seen, heard, understood, and valued. When patients walk into Harper, Danielle said, they don't check part of themselves at the door. And she spoke then of the Polish grandmother who cried at being addressed in her native tongue after years of isolation, of the undocumented father who received care without fear, of the refugee child who laughed during a checkup because the nurse spoke to him like an Annie from home. And the auditorium was silent again, but this time it was filled with something electric, hope, perhaps, or the ache of recognition, and Danielle leaned in, her voice quieter now. I'm not sharing this story because I'm special, she said. I'm sharing it because I know I'm not. And this was the part of the talk that always made people cry. I'm one of millions of people who were told to shrink, to mute themselves, to abandon what makes them whole in order to survive, and her eyes scanned the room, catching glimmers of nods, of tears being quietly dabbed with tissue. But survival is not the same as living, she continued, and what the world needs, desperately, is not more of the same, but more of the real. And behind her, the final montage began. Images of her walking the halls of her center, laughing with staff, holding a baby in the maternity ward, sitting at a desk with a teenage interpreter program recruit, smiling softly with her mother over tea, now living healthier, stronger. Because her daughter never forgot to call, and then the screen faded to black, and the only thing left was Danielle, her voice steady as stone. So today, I stand here to say, never silence who you are. And as the final line echoed across the room, every person in that auditorium stood, one after another, not in the forced rhythm of polite applause, but in the kind of slow, reverent standing that comes when someone has not only told the truth, but has embodied it. And Danielle stepped back from the podium, her heart full, her story not an ending but a door for others to walk through. And on the screen, as the lights began to dim, one final line lingered in glowing white letters, never silence who you are. It might be exactly what the world needs. If you enjoyed Danielle Harper's powerful journey from being fired for speaking her native language to becoming the founder of her own medical center, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories like this one. We'd love to hear what you think about the story. Was it fair what happened to Danielle in the hospital? What are your thoughts on Edward Langston's unexpected role in her transformation? How did you feel watching her walk into that boardroom in Warsaw and later open the Harper Wellness Center? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. What moment stood out to you the most, and how do you feel about the way it all ended? Also, let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to rate this story on a scale of 1 to 10. Your feedback helps us bring you more meaningful content. Thanks for watching, and remember, never silence who you are. It might be exactly what the world needs.